Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Facebook Live session on renters' rights. My name is Colleen Ryan. I'm an attorney with LAS's Eviction Right to Counsel program, and I'm joined by Matty Templeton, who's a legal navigator with our program. And so Matty tonight is going to walk us through a Know Your Rights presentation about the most essential things you should know about your rights as a tenant, and then we'll leave some time for question and answers as well.
Thanks so much, Colleen. So I'm Matty. I'm a legal navigator on the Eviction Right to Counsel project. And we're going to talk a little bit about your rights as a tenant, some important things to keep in mind, some best practices, and just generally how to make sure that you can protect yourself and your rights. So we'll talk about what the Eviction Right to Counsel program is and a little bit about legal aid as well. And then we're going to talk about landlord-tenant responsibilities and best practices. We'll talk a little bit about paying the rent, and then what the eviction process in Nashville looks like. So first, the Legal Aid Society. So we are a private nonprofit law firm that provides education and representation in civil matters for low-income individuals, families, and seniors who normally could not afford legal services. And our mission is to advance, defend, and enforce the legal rights of low-income and vulnerable people in order to secure for them the basic necessities of life. We're committed to providing resources to low-income people in all 48 counties in Tennessee. So that is these 48 counties across Middle Tennessee. We have 8 offices that serve those counties in a number of different practice areas. In particular, Colleen and I work with Eviction Right to Counsel, which is a new program that's specifically in Davidson County. So most of the information we're going to talk about today is Davidson County specific. Additionally, I'm not an attorney. I'm only going to be providing legal information. And Colleen, though she is an attorney, can only provide legal advice to her clients. So today we're really just going to be giving some general information and best practices. We will try to answer your questions as best we can. But if sometimes when questions are specific to an individual situation, we're not going to be able to answer those. We'll just be able to provide some kind of general information and best practices. So first, I want to start with the big 3 things to remember. So if you tune out and turn off this presentation after this slide, but you remember those 3 things, I will still be very happy. And they are: 1, that your landlord cannot lock you out without taking you to court first. 2, that you cannot stop paying your rent because your landlord hasn't made repairs, because you'll probably get evicted. And 3, that you should always read your lease, because a lot of rules can change depending on what your lease says. We'll go into more detail about all 3 of those as we move on and talk about those topics at length. So first, the Eviction Right to Counsel program. So we're a new program funded by the Metro Council here in Nashville to provide free legal services and education to eligible people facing eviction in Nashville. And some of those services look like representing clients in court, providing legal advice, and teaching renters about their rights with trainings just like this. In order to be eligible for our program services, you have to live in Davidson County, and you have to have an income at or below the 400% of the federal poverty level. Which is a great increase over what legal aid is normally able to do, and something that we're really grateful for. In addition, because of our partnership with the Nashville Hispanic Bar Association, which is one of the organizations joining us on this project, we're able to serve any Davidson County residents regardless of citizenship status. So we take cases across the housing spectrum. But when our resources get low, there are a number of focus areas that we try to really focus our time and our efforts and resources on, because these are areas that primarily affect marginalized communities in Nashville, and areas that we're really able to get involved with these cases and make a positive impact for our clients. And those are discrimination, so fair housing violations, discrimination based on protected categories. So things like race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, religion, family status, or disability. We also focus on helping people in public and subsidized housing. That might look like MDHA public housing here in Nashville. It might also be Section 8 vouchers or other forms of subsidized income restricted housing because we know that those wait lists are long and it can be incredibly difficult to get into those properties and even harder to get back in once you've been evicted. So we really try and make sure that we are keeping people in their subsidized housing. We also focus on domestic violence. So primarily that is assisting victims of domestic violence in exiting their current living situation or in evicting their abuser if they may be living with them. And finally, we focus on illegal lockouts and utility shutoffs. So like we'll talk about later in the presentation, there are very specific rules that landlords need to go through in order to evict a tenant. And if they don't follow those rules, whether that is changing the locks before going to court or shutting off utilities to try and get the tenant to leave, that is considered an illegal eviction. And that's one of our serious focus areas where we try to get involved and either get the tenant back into their unit or try to terminate the lease and get the tenant out without any sort of penalty. So first we'll talk about basic landlord responsibilities. And something important to come along with this is to always read your lease. Because even though these are the basics for the landlord and the tenant responsibilities that we'll talk about next, a lot of these rules can change depending on what's written into your lease. So even though it's very long and it's very complicated, I know mine is, it's always best practice to read your lease just to see, what additional rights you might have or what rights you might be losing because you've waived them in your lease. So the first things that landlords are responsible for are keeping your apartment habitable and making repairs. So that might be the habitability requirement includes things like keeping your utilities in order, making sure that the lights are on as long as you're paying the utility bills, fixing if there are floods in your apartment or fire damage, things like that. There's also responsibility for landlords not to discriminate against or harass their tenants based on those protected categories that we just talked about. Landlords are also required to give a written list of charges when keeping the security deposit. If they don't do that, they cannot keep the security deposit. And this is something that we see pretty often and something that tenants are able to generally solve that situation for themselves as long as they know this information. Landlords are also not allowed to lock tenants out of the apartment without going to court and following that eviction process. And we're going to talk later about what that process is and what exactly the landlords are required to do. Tenants also have some responsibilities. Those might be keeping your apartment and your common areas clean, paying the rent when it's due. And we'll talk a little bit later about best practices for paying the rent, things like grace periods and other important things to know about. Tenants also have to provide their landlord with reasonable access to their home. This might be for the landlord to come in and make repairs. It might be at the end of a tenant's lease for the landlord to be able to show the home to new tenants. It doesn't mean the landlord can come in with no warning anytime that they like, but if there is a specific reason, especially one that's written into the lease, the tenant needs to allow the landlord to enter the home. Tenants also have to tell their landlord in writing when they need repairs. A lot of the time it is the landlord's responsibility to make those repairs as long as they weren't intentionally caused by the tenant, but it is still the tenant's responsibility to tell the landlord that those repairs need to be made. Tenants also have to follow the rules of the lease, especially when it comes to guests and roommates. So only people who are specifically named on the lease are allowed to reside in the apartment, not including children under the age of 18. But if someone is living with you and they're not in the lease, then you are in violation of your lease and you could be evicted for that. So it's really important to follow the rules of that lease. And even with guests, if a guest stays longer than a certain amount of time, as it's written on your lease, that guest might be considered a permanent resident in the home. And then you would have someone living with you who wasn't on the lease and you could be evicted. So it's very important to read those rules, make sure you know exactly what they are and follow them. Tenants also have to respect their neighbors. This is where things like noise complaints come into play. We see people being evicted because they are engaging in some sort of dangerous activity. These lease violations, sometimes you'll have the opportunity to fix them and sometimes you won't. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the eviction process, but it's always important to know what those are in advance to make sure you're not accidentally violating your lease. So when it comes to evictions, the next topic, Your landlord cannot lock you out without taking you to court first. There is a very specific process that landlords have to follow before they can evict you from your home and before they can remove you from that home. And if a landlord doesn't follow that, then they are violating the lease. And if they are, or they are violating the law. And if your landlord does try to lock you out without taking you to court, then you should call legal aid, because that is one of our focus areas and something that we are really able to help a lot of tenants with. So landlords do have some requirements for giving notice, for telling you in advance before they take you to court. The first one is for missing rent. If you get behind on your rent, you might have 14 days notice where they have to tell you 2 weeks before taking you to court and giving you 2 weeks to make up that rent. However, that's one of the rights that can be waived if it's written into your lease that you don't have that right anymore. And most leases in Nashville use the same kind of form that includes a note saying that that right is waived. So most tenants in Nashville will not actually get those 14 days. You might, and it's always important to read your lease and see if you do, but it's pretty common that we see that right being waived. If your lease is ending, you also get some notice in advance. Generally, if you have a lease, your landlord has to tell you at least 60 or 90 days in advance, depending on what it says in your lease. If you live there without a lease, if you're paying month to month, maybe your landlord has to tell you 30 days in advance. And if you're paying week to week, your landlord has to tell you 10 days in advance. There's also notice for lease violations. If you have a lease violation, like having someone in your apartment who's not on the lease, or you're getting noise complaints from your neighbors, generally you have 14 days to fix whatever that violation is before your landlord can take you to court. And those violations, again, can vary depending on what's in your lease. But there are some violations. These are primarily things like dangerous behavior, criminal activities, drug use on the property, where you might not get that full 14 days. Instead, you'd only get 3 days, and you wouldn't get any chance to fix that. You would automatically go to court after those 3 days. So once you get that notice, the second step is that you'll get what's called a detainer warrant. This is something that's going to be served to you either by the sheriff or a process server, or if they're not able to give it to you in person, it might be mailed to you. But this is going to be a document that says that you're being evicted, and it's going to tell you what day you have to go to court. After you get that detainer warrant, you'll have that court date. And then let's say in the worst case, you lose on that court date. You still have 10 days to move. After those 10 days, your landlord can file for a writ of restitution, which is what allows the sheriff to come and lock you out of the property. But you still have a full 10 days from the judgment against you, when the judge says you have to move out, until the day that you actually have to be out of the property. And if your landlord locks you out during those 10 days, that is still an illegal eviction. And that is still something that we really focus on helping tenants with. And even if after those 10 days, your landlord doesn't get the writ of restitution that they need and doesn't have the sheriff present when they lock you out or remove your belongings, that is also an illegal eviction. Something that's important to know is that those detainer warrants that people get can be confusing. And sometimes they might have your name, not have your name on the papers. They might just say all occupants. In that case, we always say that you should still go to court. And we say in general, you should always go to court, even if your name isn't on the papers and it's just your address. Even if you don't think you have a defense, you agree that you are behind on your rent. Even if you don't want to stay in the apartment and you were planning on moving anyway, it's important to go to court, because even if your name isn't on the papers, it still might be for you. A lot of times we'll see it just say all occupants instead of the actual names of the residents. Even if you don't think you have a defense, maybe. You might be able to go to court and just figure out exactly how much it is that you owe. Make sure you're not being charged any more than you should be. And if you don't want to stay in the apartment, you might be able to negotiate with your landlord and avoid an eviction that's going to show up on your record, and just agree that you're going to move out instead. So like I mentioned earlier, after an eviction, you have 10 days to move, and only the sheriff can remove you from the property. Another reason to go to court is that the judge might be able to give you more than 10 days to move if you need 2 weeks before you're able to move into a new apartment that you're waiting for. So just another reason to always go to court. All right. So now when it comes to paying the rent, so these are our best practices for paying the rent, just things that we generally advise our clients and all renters in Nashville to do. The first is to ask for receipts. It's always important to get receipts, whether that's a physical receipt from paying in the office or on the online portal, or whether that's just texting your landlord after you pay, hi, I just paid my rent for this month. Did you get it? And making sure that your landlord says yes. When you have receipts like that, you're able to prove that you paid, and you're usually able to prove how much you paid. It's very important to be able to do that in case your landlord takes you to court and starts saying that you didn't pay. If you did and you have receipts, you can prove that you did. Otherwise, it might be very difficult to do that. The second thing that's good to do is to pay on time. It's very important to pay on time because there is no legal defense to being late on your rent in Tennessee. If you are late on your rent, your landlord can evict you. So if you get behind even a day on your rent, your landlord can and often will take you to court. And then the third thing to do is communicate. I know it is very scary to tell your landlord, I'm going to be late on my rent this month. But at least if you tell your landlord that in advance, you can explain why. You can tell them, I'm going to be late, but I'll still have the rent just a week afterwards, or you can work out some sort of agreement. It's always better to do that than it is to not pay your rent, not tell your landlord why, and all of a sudden you find yourself in court. So something important to know about when it comes to paying your rent on time is what's called the grace period. So in Tennessee, you have 5 days to pay your rent after the date that it says it's due on your lease. So, for example, if your lease says that your rent is due every month on the 1st, you have until the 5th to pay your rent before it's considered late. And then on the morning of the 6th, your rent would be considered late. So you do get those 5 extra days to get that money together. After that, you can have a late fee or an eviction or even both. And that late fee can be up to 10% of your rent, but it can't be any more than that. So something that we see a lot, especially recently in Nashville, are rent increases. And it's important to know when your landlord can increase your rent. If you've signed a lease, your rent probably can't go up. There's a couple exceptions for certain types of properties. These are called LIHTC or low-income housing tax credit properties. If you live in a property that is income restricted, but not income based, so you can only live there if you have below a certain income, but your rent isn't adjusted based on that actual income, that might be a LIHTC property. And in these properties, because they are based on the IRS and median incomes that they set, they're actually able to increase your rent during your lease. But if that's true, it will say so on your lease that they can increase it more than once a year. Otherwise, your rent is probably going to stay exactly where it is when you sign the lease until the end of the lease. If you don't have a lease, your landlord can raise your rent at any time, but they do have to tell you first. So they have to tell you 30 days in advance if you pay month to month, or 10 days in advance if you pay week to week, the same as non-renewals. And your landlord also has to tell you in advance if they're going to raise your rent after your lease ends, in order to give you time to decide whether you're going to accept that or move out and give them notice. And then it's also important to know about security deposits. So a security deposit is generally a payment that you make when you move into your apartment for the first time that insures the apartment against damages. There's no limit as to what that can be. It's usually about a month of rent. But the idea is that if you don't cause any damages to the apartment, you'll get that back. However, some security deposits are non-refundable, and instead they're written into your lease as move-in charges. So another reason to read your lease is to always make sure whether or not your security deposit is refundable. And if it is, it can still be withheld, but only for certain reasons. That security deposit can be withheld for any damages that you've caused to the apartment and to pay for the repairs for those damages. And it can also be withheld for unpaid rent and for any fees that you might not have paid. And like we mentioned earlier, it's important to know that your landlord needs to tell you exactly what they're withholding that security deposit for and why. They need to provide you with a list of charges that are discovered within 30 days of moving out. And if they don't do that, they're not able to keep that security deposit. There's also some other rules about what they have to do with the security deposit. Namely, they have to keep it in a separate account on its own instead of putting it in their own personal bank account or mixing it with any other money. If they do that, they also can't keep your security deposit. And then I'd like to talk about repairs. A really, really common thing that we see is people saying, my landlord hasn't made any repairs on my unit in 5 months, so why should I have to pay my rent? And I get that. I really do. It makes sense. The problem is that the law in Tennessee doesn't agree. And if you stop paying your rent because your landlord hasn't made repairs, even if you have a pretty good reason like that, then technically you're behind on your rent. And like I mentioned earlier, there's no legal defense for being behind on your rent, which means that your landlord can and probably will take you to court and try to evict you. So even if your landlord isn't making repairs, we say that it's always good practice to keep paying your rent and talk to legal aid or one of the other organizations on ERTC and figure out what your next steps might be. So the first thing that you'd want to do in that situation is tell your landlord in writing. It's always good to do this in writing so that you have proof of the request. The next thing, you could maybe call codes or the health department in Nashville. It's important to know that codes complaints are public records, and a lot of landlords don't want their buildings to be listed on the codes website and to have public records saying that there were problems with their buildings. And then you might have some other solutions if you talk to an attorney first and neither of those are working. That might be something like withholding your rent for the month in order to pay for the repairs yourself, or breaking your lease without any penalty and finding somewhere else to move. But it's really important to talk to an attorney first because those are really difficult things for people to do on their own. So before we finish up and start to take some questions, I want to go back over those big 3 things to remember. And these are just the 3 most important things that I'd like you to walk away from today with. And that is first, that your landlord cannot lock you out without taking you to court first. Like we talked about, there is a very specific process that landlords have to follow in order to evict their tenant. And they cannot lock you out or shut off your utilities or try to make you leave without going through that process. The second thing is to not stop paying your rent, even if your landlord hasn't made repairs. Because if you stop paying your rent, you'll probably get evicted, whether it's for a reason like that or not. And the third is to always read your lease, because a lot of the rules that we talked about today can change depending on what your lease says. There are some things that might be in your lease that could be illegal, in which case you wouldn't have to follow them. But a lot of these rules can get changed legally depending on what your landlord puts in that lease. All right, well, thanks so much for listening. I think we're going to take some questions.
Thanks, Matty, for that super informative presentation. I don't see any questions yet, but please feel free to put them in the chat.
And I'd like to mention as well, so the 2 organizations that are listed here, one is us at the Legal Aid Society. The other is Conexión Américas and the Nashville Hispanic Bar Association. They're one of the partners on this program. The Nashville Hispanic Bar is the other organization that provides attorneys and takes cases. If you have a legal issue, you can certainly call them. There's also a number of other organizations. There's AMAC, the American Muslim Advisory Council, working on this project. There's also the Nashville Conflict Resolution Center and the People's Alliance for Transit, Housing, and Employment. And all of these organizations work together to provide the services that ERTC provides. And if you need help, you can call any of those organizations and they will direct you to the right place.
Well, thank you, everyone. And thanks again, Matty, for all of that great information. I think we'll go ahead and finish up here. But please, folks, if you have any questions or need more information, visit our website. And thanks again.